Salams from the People's Dispatch Studios here in New Delhi. I'm Siddhantani and you're watching Daily Debrief on a day when we managed to get all our guests as well as our reporters in the studio to talk about the topics of the day, which are, of course, today, the battle for politics of consensus versus a single global hegemon at the UN General Assembly. In Tunisia, opposition leaders are being targeted by the state's anti-terror agencies. And finally, in Pakistan, farmers are protesting a multi-billion-dollar project conceived under the leadership of the man who refuses to stay out of Pakistan news, cricket star turned politician Imran Khan. First up, at the UN General Assembly, the theme this year, a meeting being held in the flesh at the UN headquarters in New York City after a gap of nearly 3 years because of the COVID-19 pandemic is, and I quote, transformative solutions to interlocking challenges. Interlocking clearly because the UN realizes the issues of war, climate change and global food insecurity, three very broad but very serious global crises, are deeply connected. The politics of the debate this year is understandably so, particularly fierce. The pandemic played a major role in re-establishing just how big the North-South, or East-West, however you look at it, divide is in real terms. And while the US and some of its Western allies push on with an agenda of division and global hegemony, vast developing nations such as China and India are seeking more concrete solutions to these global problems. Secretary General Antonio Guterres has warned that the world is in grave peril. And Newsclick Editor-in-Chief Prabir Purkayastha is in studio now to help us understand how only consensus can lead us to a better future. Prabir, good to have you back in the studio with us after a decent break. We're well aware of the sort of extent of the issues facing the world, and in that context, perhaps multilateralism, internationalism is the need of the hour to solve some of these issues. What is the relevance? The UN General Assembly is, of course, on. What is the relevance or the role that the UN needs to play in making all of this happen so that we're sort of together in dealing with the issues of war, climate change, etc.?
The essential issue for the UN has been that as long as there was a Cold War, the UN still seemed to have played a role because it was accepted that the Security Council could only function through consensus, and that consensus needed both the parties to the Cold War to be on board.
Right.
So that consensual part of the politics was also a part of the long drawn-out Cold War, as it is said, between the United States and the Soviet Union. So the NATO forces as of today and the Soviet Union, and at that time the Warsaw Pact.
Right.
Now, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, it also appeared to the world that we had now a unipolar world, and therefore US and its allies could set the rules of the game. It didn't need the United Nations anymore. So all this talk about the rule-based order, etc., and the responsibility to protect means that it could intervene in other countries, and there Russia would not oppose. China alone was not sufficient to really stop all of this. Then we saw about 10, 15, 20 years the talk about the single hegemon in the world. So UN seemed to have lost a lot of its relevance at that period. It doesn't still seem to have regained it because the agencies of the United Nations are still in quote-unquote Western hands.
Right.
And we saw that when there is an investigation, say, in Iraq, on the question of poison gas. Then what comes out of that in chemical, biological war kind of scenarios essentially is not what the experts say, but what it seems the agencies want them to say. And it has become much more biased in the investigation it has done on various occasions. So that being said, can we return to an UN where things will be done through consensus? Then would the United Nations Security Council have a role in place like Ukraine or in NATO's eastward expansion?
Right.
But as I said, it depends on leaving the road to confrontation and then a road to reconciliation. Okay, there are boundaries which we'll respect, within which we'll work, and we'll respect each other. That is unfortunately not the scenario. You can still see the US and its allies talking about a rule-based international order,
Right.
which is not the law-based international order, The international law is ultimately the Security Council. That's what it's supposed to be. So this rule-based order, which will be decided by G7, the ex-colonial, settler colonial powers, still seems to be the what seems to play. And therefore, when you talk about war, this is the problem, that between rule-based international order and something which is agreeable to both sides, Russia, China, as well as the G7, as well as countries like Brazil, India, and so on. So I think that kind of consensus making can happen only if the UN plays its due role. UN can play its due role only when the NATO allies accept that they need peace. So that's the big one.
Right.
The other big one, which is I think what all the Latin American countries have been saying, that you talk about global warming. Amazon has to be saved. If you want to save Amazon, what do we have to do? And instead of that, what you are interested in, war on drugs, you want more oil, you want more gas, you want essentially countries to give those assets over to you. And while you will run countries based on what your needs are, this is not what the world needs. And they have said that essentially, if you look at what Petro has said and what Xiomara Castro has said, the two presidents who spoke in the General Assembly, both of them have said essentially that this is destructive what you're doing, the war in the name of war on drugs, and what you are not doing is how to save the Amazon. That's what should be the focus. And the war on drugs, of course, is a huge issue in Latin America, because that's what the US promotes. In one hand, the war on drugs. At the same time, it's been cahoots with the drug lords who supported, for instance, earlier the Mexican government, the Colombian government, and also, as we know, in Honduras, the president who overthrew Zelaya, who came in as a part of overthrowing Zelaya. And he is now being arraigned in the United States on drug charges. And everybody knew it, that he was leading, he was in cahoots again with the drug smugglers and the criminal elements in Honduras. And Xiomara Castro has also talked about the war on drugs is something that the US has to rethink on, because that's destroying essentially societies, because it's promoting drug lords. It's not actually a war on drugs as much as monopolies which are built on criminalization of drugs.
Praveen, on the sidelines, this L69 grouping of countries like India, etc., that you were mentioning, countries from Latin America, Asia, and the Pacific, are getting together to talk specifically on reforms to the Security Council. How do you see those dialogues going and that process going? And is it even possible to have sort of some kind of commonality of reforms that this grouping of nations can seek from the United Nations?
Well, getting new Security Council members is a long overdue process, but it's also a very, very difficult process, because ultimately it has to happen virtually through consensus. So that doesn't seem to be on the cards at the moment. Yes, historically, there are small countries over there which were important as colonial powers, but no longer so. But they still are the Security Council. Okay, it's overrepresentation, obviously, of the European nations and of the European nations. So that's a part of the history that is there, or immediate history. So reforms of the United Nations is a much longer process. But at the moment, can we get a functioning United Nations, which becomes the arena to talk about peace and how to proceed towards a future which will at least see the worst of global warming being avoided. Now, those kind of things are where UN can still play a role, but then it has to, the countries which have been backing the so-called rule-based international orders have to reconcile themselves that the global consensus between major forces has to be there. Of course, India, the countries like Brazil, India, South Africa, others as well, will play a role in all of this. But it also depends on the Security Council permanent members to be able to look towards a compromise. If you want to defeat Russia, you want to break up Russia, which is what the US policies openly are at the moment. Weaken and defeat Russia again. If that is a policy, then of course there is a bigger threat. And China is also in an economic war with the West at the moment. So you can see it's not just the UN, it's also the WTO. The WTO as a platform is no longer virtually functioning because the US has decided that's not the platform on which it will play. So the dispute settlement process has been virtually completely sabotaged.
Undermined,
completely sabotaged because they have not allowed new adjudicators to take positions over there, and that's the US. So they're not interested in international bodies anymore. So that seems to be the thrust that we see, that we will dictate what the world should do. And the process of sanctions, the process of reconciliation between opposite sides, trying to see what the via media can be, what is at least a compromise. That position has been given up. So I think what we've seen in the last 30 years is that is the culmination of that is completely bypassing or marginalizing the United Nations. And even in WTO, which we opposed at one point being too dominated by the West. But even that's not enough for the United States or the West. So therefore, how they can move from that into trade wars, which is bypassing the WTO, that seems to be the new game in town. And that is, at the end of it, it does seem that it heightens international tensions and it basically fractures the world. And if we are going to confront challenges like global warming, which is a global challenge, this is a road to the complete destruction of civilization. And that's what has come up in the United Nations General Assembly. This is what the Latin American leaders have said. They have been the most important speakers on the first day. We'll see what the others have to say and what India will say, because India has been very, very much playing a game of hedging its bets. Sometimes here, sometimes there, not too loud, not ruffle anybody's feathers, but we want to have our own cake and eat it too. So that seems to be the policy as of now. So the idea that realpolitik works and we don't have to take the largest issues into account, as the world is leading towards a crisis where such positions are not viable anymore.
Absolutely. Thanks very much for that update, Praveer. And we'll obviously have you back on to talk about some of those issues more specifically, because it also relates to food insecurity and things like that. So thanks again. And of course, we'll be talking about Pakistan later on in the show, one of the countries that is currently facing the brunt of what Praveer was talking about in the context of climate change and how that has affected it in the recent past with floods and now deepening sort of agricultural crisis emerging there. Next up, in Tunisia, the political crisis has taken another ugly turn with the detention and interrogation of former Prime Minister Ali Larayed, a senior functionary of Ennahda, the largest party in Tunisia's parliament before it was dissolved by President Kais Saied in what many have described as a democratic coup that reversed 10 years of gains made by the revolution. Dr. Abdul Rahman covers the region for People's Dispatch and is in studio now with details on the charges against the former Prime Minister, as well as the wider implications on Ennahda as well as party politics in Tunisia. Abdul, good to have you in studio. What exactly is going on? What has he been charged against, and how did that process of investigation or interrogation go down?
Well, there was a case filed in December last year. Of course, opposition figures are saying that this was basically prompted by the Kais Saied administration, in which a petitioner basically sought action against people, leaders, she accused, who basically were involved in sending Tunisian youth to war zones in Libya, in Syria, and other places. The petitioner claimed, the person who filed the case claimed that these leaders, primarily some of the leaders of the Ennahda party, the ruling or the largest party in Tunisian politics post the revolution 2011, have been involved in radicalizing the Tunisian youth and sending them. So there are scores of people trapped in Libya, and hundreds of Tunisians are trapped in Syria at this moment. And the people responsible are the leaders. So that case basically is now reaching to some kind of, you can say, action, and which basically the former Prime Minister, who was there for 1 year, less than a year in 2013-14, you rightly mentioned Laraib, he has been already put behind the bars, and the head of the Tunisian Ennahda party, Rashid Ghannouchi, is basically called for interrogation and all. There is another leader who has been also called and interrogated. So it seems that the large number of Ennahda leaders basically are entrapped.
Being targeted, right? So on the merits of what we know about the case, to what extent is this legitimate, or do we look at it as quite simply removal of leadership of any kind of opposition to Kais Saied?
Well, this is a fact that a large section of Tunisians, youth in particular, have been radicalized, and like youth in different other parts of the world. And during the rise of the ISIS and other extremist groups in the West Asia, some of them did migrate, basically went to fight on behalf of those groups. And but whether the leadership of Ennahda has been responsible for these radicalization and even sending, by the way, that is a charge, of these youth to these places, it is most likely it is a case of political fabrication, some kind of attempt to kind of target it. We don't know. There is no clear understanding on that. Right. And therefore, it is seen in a suspicion, primarily because, primarily because of the last year's democratic coup, or coup, whatever you call it, of Kais Saied. There has been a consistent targeting of opposition leaders across the party line. There has been, in fact, journalists and human rights activists who have also been targeted, primarily because they have spoken some quote-unquote facts, which basically puts Kais Saied into a corner and a spot. So, for example, one journalist was charged because he spoke on TV during a show that there is an understanding between the UGTT, the largest trade union group in Tunisia, and Kais Saied. So, because of this only, he is behind bars for last 6 months. Right. So, then there is a case of a comedian who migrated out of the country, claiming the restrictions on freedom of expression and so on and so forth. We know how the political opponents, the judiciary in particular, has been targeted in the name of corruption and other nepotism and so on and so forth. Then apart from the Ennahda, other political groups have also been targeted. Only groups have not been targeted so far are those who have been supporter to Kais Saied's moves. So, of course, in the larger context and looking at the development, political development in the country, and the kind of political changes Kais Saied is trying to bring through his one-man rule, basically this should see, all these developments should be seen in that context. Suspicion.
Right. Yeah. So very quickly, I think we're running out of time, Abdul. But where do we go from here now? How does the story progress?
I think this may backfire also, because Ennahda, as I said before, is the largest party with a very strong support, and that particularly targeting senior party leaders can lead to further destabilization in the country. There is already a movement led by left and other groups, basically, who have asked for boycott of the coming elections, most probably in December. And we already know that the so-called referendum, which happened in July, there was participation, very less participation, less than
only 30%. From, again, the side that is in support of it.
Right. Exactly. So, given the larger divide in the country, and given the fact that there is already mobilization against Kais Saied government, this may lead to further isolation, because Ennahda is not anti-establishment in that sense. Yeah. And if you are trying to target these people, that creates a possibility that this will also turn against the government. And yeah.
All right. Thanks very much, Abdul. And our final story, as I was mentioning earlier, is from Pakistan, which has been in the news this monsoon season as one of the countries most drastically impacted by the current effects of global warming. despite playing only a very minor role in contributing to carbon dioxide emissions. Floods have seriously damaged the agricultural season as well as critical infrastructure. Now, while the country may not be at fault in the larger sense, the government is pushing ahead with development projects that ignore ground realities as well as local environmental factors. One such project is the Ravi Riverfront Urban Development Project being executed by the state-owned Ravi Urban Development Authority that the provincial government in Punjab is very much committed to. Farmers and landowners in the province, which is a major agricultural area, are protesting the project and what they call forced possession of farmlands in contradiction to orders by the Supreme Court. Shreya is going to use our magical revolving chair, which we haven't put into action for a long time, and tell us more about this developing or this new protest. Shreya, welcome back to Daily Debrief. We'll get into the details of this urban development or the riverfront development project in a bit. First, tell us what exactly the protests are about, who is protesting, and what they are asking for.
Yeah, Siddhant, so on 21st September, farmers from the Punjab province, they started protesting in front of the Ravi Urban Development Authority's office in Lahore. Now, what they are protesting is what surfaced on the social media a couple of days ago, that videos of crops being destroyed by heavy machinery, by private contractors, and there were rumors that these crops are being destroyed to acquire land for the Ravi Riverfront Development Project.
Right.
So this Ravi project, we'll get into it later, but the concern of the farmers is that the land acquisition that's happening right now, it's not legal, because I think in January, the Lahore High Court had declared this project to be illegal and unconstitutional for many factors.
Right.
And this whole project has been mired in controversy since its beginning. So what's happening right now is this land acquisition is completely illegal, and it's happening despite court orders. It's a forceful dispossession of farmlands in a province that's heavily dependent on agriculture. And this is completely contra vires to what the court order has been. Yeah.
Right. So tell us a bit about the scale of this project and what kind of impact it will have. Because the Ravi is, of course, part of the sort of 5-river system, and it's bound to have a wider ecological impact as well as an agricultural impact, of course. So a bit more detail on the project itself.
Yeah, so let's get into the details. So this project was initially conceived somewhere around 2006, but the Imran Khan government, the PTI government, it initiated it, launched it in 2020, August 2020, and this now is a 5 trillion Pakistani rupees mega project, and it is supposed to be the second biggest planned city in Pakistan after Islamabad.
Right.
So what's happening is that this project is supposed to build a Dubai-like city with these high rises and everything along the 46-kilometer stretch of the Ravi River.
Right.
In Punjab. So these lands, the 46 kilometers, 77% of this land is agricultural land. And the authority that is going to acquire the land is the RUDA, the Ravi Urban Development Authority. Interestingly, this is not a regular property developer.
Right.
The project itself came into being by introducing a legislation in 2019, and this authority was given extra powers as a supra-developmental authority to acquire land. Now, land acquisition in Pakistan is legal. The Land Acquisition Bill of 1894 allows acquisition by the government, and it's allowed based on the landowners are compensated. The concern of the farmers, coming back to the current issue, is that first of all, the compensation they are being given is much below the market rates. This quote-unquote development project is essentially being driven forward. So this is going to be like a real estate city, and it's going to have all sorts of entertainment and various things to it. A lot of controversies around it, whether it's going to be a sustainable city, whether it will revive the Ravi River, whether it will be ecologically sustainable for the Punjab province, since it's going to take up a lot of the agricultural land.
Yeah.
Now, these are a lot of controversies, and none of it is legally solved or clear either from the end of RUDA or from the end of the government. Go back to why this project was declared unconstitutional, because Ruda has acted as the local government, quoting the Lahore High Court.
Right.
So to put this entire issue, the project, the farmers and the protests today, all of this into context, Pakistan, like you mentioned, is going through massive floods of epic proportion right now. And it doesn't make ecological sense or financial sense to be depriving farmers at this point of time of their lands when their crops have been devastated. In neighboring province, Sindh, there are reports and there are studies of how 80% of major crops that sustain the economy of Pakistan, like wheat, rice, cotton, they've been destroyed, nearly 80%. And even in the coming seasons, it looks like the food security problem of Pakistan is going to increase, especially at a time when it's having high inflation, the debts is rising, and also other things are in tandem.
Yeah.
So
political crisis.
Yes, exactly. The political crisis, it's everywhere throughout this project. So it doesn't make sense to talk about and how the PTI Chief Minister right now in Punjab is pushing through this project. It doesn't make sense. Given the floods, the most that the government has announced in terms of relief is giving 25,000 Pakistani rupees to each flood affectee, which is definitely, given the $10 billion loss, the flood bill that's coming according to the planning minister, may not be sufficient. And since we don't see any farmers related relief package anywhere inside, I think this is going to be a larger issue with the farmers. Yeah.
Right. Seems very much an approach of, if they don't have bread, let them eat cake sort of situation. We'll ask you to keep tracking that, Shreya, as things develop, but I think we'll wrap up here for today. And that's also a wrap for this episode of Daily Debrief from Shreya, myself, and all of us here at People's Dispatch. Thank you very much for watching. As always, for more details on these stories as well as the other work we do, head over to our website, peoplesdispatch.org, and give us a follow on the social media platform of your choice. We will, inshallah, be back same time, same place tomorrow. Until then, stay safe. Goodbye.